Well, I do want to discuss the Middle East. For that, national security analyst, retired Marine intelligence officer, and the host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer, joining me. Hal, there's been a lot of developments, and I want to get straight into it. We're looking at a live image of southern Israel, this camera pointed toward the Gaza skyline. So, Hal, ceasefire talks are resuming this weekend in Cairo, and Axios had an exclusive conversation with Senator Lindsey Graham, who was in Israel just before Thanksgiving. Graham speaking with President-elect Trump regularly, and he says that Trump wants to see a ceasefire and hostage deal in Gaza before he assumes office in January. How much pull does Trump have as a president-elect, Hal? Do the words of an incoming president carry the same gravity as a president?
Austin, that's interesting. We're watching a kind of a dynamic across the Middle East. Certainly, the Iranians have basically factored this into all their planning. And keep in mind, Hamas, Hezbollah, all these groups, the Houthis are all Iranian proxies. I'm not saying Iran has 100% control over them, but they have definitely factored this in. And they're also looking at these second, third order effects. They're looking at what just happened up in Syria. They're looking at elsewhere and saying, maybe, all the proxies are saying, does Iran really have the same power, the same capabilities that it had, going back months ago, or have they been degraded to the point where they really, they can't back these various players up very well? And certainly Hamas is looking at this saying, we don't think they back us probably at all at this point. So I think that it's rather an interesting proposal, if you will. It puts certainly the return of the hostages front and center, which is really interesting because you juxtapose that with what's going on in Cairo right now, where you have Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Fatah, and of course Hamas all talking. And what's interesting is they aren't even talking about returning of the hostages. They're all focused on the day after and power sharing between these groups, and it really just seems like an aspirational academic discussion because I don't see any situation where Israel's going to allow Palestinian Islamic Jihad or certainly Hamas to have any control over any territory in Gaza. So they seem to be almost in a sort of delusional sense of that. But the reality is they probably have gathered, at least from the U.S. side, that whatever window of opportunity there was to get something done, that window's closing very quickly, and that Trump has a very different idea of how to handle these situations, and he has a very different idea of what to do about certainly Iran and possibly clipping what little power remains of Iran to project power around the region.
So let's talk a little bit more about Trump. Axios says that Israeli officials believe the Trump administration might take a different approach to Gaza, specifically on what the day after the war would look like. From what you've read, Hal, what separates the Biden and Trump administrations as far as the day after goes?
Well, I think the Biden administration has been working really hard on getting a ceasefire and kind of freezing things in place, if you will. And certainly, the Biden administration has been very critical of what's sometimes called bifurcation of Gaza. Various lines like the north, the south, the Felipe line across the southern border. That Israel has said, look, they need to maintain a presence there. They need to have control. They want to create a zone around that. The Biden administration has been kind of pushing back on that. It's not clear that the Trump administration really would. It's not clear that the Trump administration would allow some sort of demilitarized zone, if you will, around the Gaza Strip, which is certainly what the Israelis want, that they can maintain complete control and make sure that nobody's going to try and infiltrate over the border, that they would have a long line of sight, if you will. And so I think that's the big concern that Hamas has, is that there won't be any pressure from Washington or significant pressure from Washington pushing back on what Netanyahu wants to put in place in Gaza. And there is that recognition. And of course, I would also go back to there's recognition that they're not going to have as much support regionally from certainly from Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is basically cutting its own deal with Israel separate and apart from whatever happens in Gaza Strip. So Hamas has got to be feeling, as does Palestinian Islamic Jihad, has to be feeling increasingly isolated in that regard. and they're looking into the future with an incoming Trump administration and saying it's not good now and it's not going to get any better.
So we're looking at, as I said, this is southern Israel. This is what ceasefire talks this weekend are going to be focusing on is Gaza and the hostages. Reuters reports that leaders of Hamas, they're arriving in Cairo this weekend for ceasefire talks with Egyptian officials. The visit is the first since the United States announced earlier this week that it would revive efforts in collaboration with Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza. A ceasefire was able to be negotiated with Hezbollah within the past week, Hal. Does that bring a new sense of optimism for similar talks with Hamas?
Well, there was some thought that it might. There was some thought that the ceasefire with Hezbollah may add a little impetus to put a ceasefire in effect with Hamas. Then the other side is that it may actually have slowed things down. That because the Hezbollah agreement is completely separate from whatever goes on in Gaza, and that Hezbollah has, simply by the facts on the ground, has had to turn its back, if you will, on whatever the situation is in Gaza, that whatever momentum or regional momentum, multi-proxy momentum, if you will, there was on Israel to come to some sort of agreement has now been lost because Israel's policies essentially are breaking apart the axis of resistance one by one. So it's really unclear. What's interesting is the talks are going in Cairo. That's another part of what's hitting Hamas is, of course, they got their delegation got kicked out of Qatar, out of Doha, and so they're having to meet in Cairo. And again, Hamas is feeling increasingly isolated. And the problem they have, and from what I've read, they are meeting right now. The problem they've had is the hostages. That is the only playing card, if you will, that they have is that they have these hostages. That's the only thing they really have to negotiate with is with the hostages. And that is first and foremost with the negotiators, certainly with the Egyptians, the Qataris were the same way. The US and the Israelis were all about getting the hostages back. That was first and foremost. And it is just and kind of going back to it, it's fascinating to see that they don't even seem able to broach the issue of hostages because once the hostages are gone, for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, there really isn't much. They don't have much left they can negotiate with. They don't control any terrain. Yes, they're an insurgent force, a terrorist force, but eventually Israel will probably deal with that in more kinetic means, if you will. And once the hostages are out, they just don't have any leverage. There's nothing that restrains the Israelis from really going in there and clearing them out once and for all. And at one time, you would have said they don't want to go in there and force because they don't want to destroy the infrastructure, the buildings, cause a humanitarian disaster in the Gaza Strip. I think that ship has sailed quite some time ago. If you look at what the situation is on the ground, that does not restrain Israel. It did for many years, but it certainly has not restrained Israel over the last year plus in terms of how they prosecuted the campaign. They're going in there to wipe out Hamas, and the only thing Hamas has is to say, look, let's negotiate the hostage release. Once the hostages are gone, Hamas really doesn't have anything to include. They're looking at an existential situation, which is, will there be a Hamas once the hostages are gone? And I'm sure they're looking at each other saying, I don't know what we have left once that's over with.
So just reading the reporting from Axios here, they again say hostage and ceasefire deal Trump wants before he takes office. Does that seem feasible before January 20th?
Possibly. And it may be, Donald Trump is a negotiator. I mean, he does deals. He does real estate deals, and he has, he wrote a book on how to, the art of the deal, and one of the things he's done, and we've seen this certainly in his talks with before he's inaugurated, the talks he's had with Canada, the talks he's had with Mexico, is he creates a situation, creates something that he can then negotiate with that has actually not been implemented. And in this case, he's trying to create the certainly the impression in the minds of Hamas and to a lesser extent PIJ that they want to cut a deal now. They want to get a deal in place before he comes into office. And once he comes into office, then whatever chance they have to get a better deal has gone out the window. This is kind of classic negotiation technique, and I don't want to say that he won't follow through on this stuff because there's certainly enough evidence historically to speak of from his first term that he will follow through on some of these things. But it's possible that this could provide the pressure, the impetus for Hamas to come to some sort of arrangement.
So, Hal, another big story out of the region today, and we're looking at some footage that came within the past 24 hours here. The Israeli military saying on Saturday that it had killed a militant who took part in the October 7th attack and who it said was also employed by a U.S. based charity, the World Central Kitchen in Gaza. Reuters quotes the family of the man saying that the man was a member of or was involved in that attack, but the family of the man saying that that is false. What the Israelis said is false, and the explanation that the IDF gave was meant to justify his unlawful killing. They said, the family said, that he was an engineer who dedicated his life to charitable work. So, Hal, two different stories being given from two different sides here. There are clearly details still to be worked out, but is it unheard of that a man who participated in the October 7th attack could also be an aid worker?
Oh, absolutely. That's been a big problem. In fact, UNRWA was had a number of, in fact, UNRWA, which is a UN aid organization for the Gaza, their primary organization. They found a number of Hamas leaders, in fact, that had UNRWA ID cards. They were working for UNRWA, so it's not at all unfeasible or infeasible or that he would have been an actual Hamas member, and he could have been involved in the October 7th attacks. One of the things that Israel is able to do with its security services, particularly Shin Bet, is as they've gained control of the ground, they're able to go in there and do a lot of different things. Of course, part of it's human intelligence, talking to people, interviewing or interrogating people, but also, going into people's homes, looking at documentation, looking at a number of things, looking in the tunnels, whatever they get, all the different ways that they can gather intelligence to figure out who was who were they connected to. They've also had the ability to look at cell phone and other communications to try and figure out who everybody was talking to. So they have a much better idea, much greater clarity on who was involved in the October 7th attacks, who was involved with Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other groups than they had, say, around October 7th or in the weeks after October 7th. And so they're tracking these individuals. They also largely control the ground. There is no militarily, really large unit, militarily controlled Hamas areas that they have. They have areas that they're still fighting in, and there's certainly some fierce resistance, and they don't completely control it. But with that, they're able to track these individuals, and there's a variety of ways they could have tracked this particular individual. I won't get into all the the tradecraft or tactics, techniques, procedures, but there are ways they could track them. And I would imagine, certainly after what happened last April with the World Central Food Kitchen, that they would have avoided trying to target one of their vehicles or target one of their facilities because of that tragic situation that happened with that WCF convoy back then. But then I would lean towards the Israelis probably had very solid target intelligence that there was an October 7th perpetrator in there. And I would imagine for a strike like this, it wasn't just anyone. It was probably one of the key leaders, somebody in a key position. And also because these leaders know they're tracked, they will go to extreme measures to avoid detection when they're moving around, which means they will put others at risk by hiding in an aid vehicle in order to, with the idea that that will deter the Israelis from striking. In this case, it didn't. But there is reports that apparently there may be some ostensibly innocent individuals that were with them that were taken out as well, that were killed. And if they are completely innocent, that's a tragic situation. But again, I don't think we're going to find out what the circumstances are completely until the fighting's done. And there's a rather forensic analysis, if you will, of all these strike missions to find out who exactly they hit and who these individuals were.
Yeah, while we're talking about it, remind us how important is the World Central Kitchen in Gaza at this point in the fight?
Well, it's one of many aid agencies. Certainly, anecdotally from the ground, they have been providing tremendous services across the board. They've been providing these central kitchens where people literally would be starving if they weren't there providing aid. So I don't want to diminish it. I don't think they're there quite in force like they were earlier. I think from what I've gathered, what happened last April definitely, of course, immediately curtailed all their operations because they shut down initially. And then it's not clear if they've come back to where they were before that original strike, but they are there. They're on the ground. They didn't walk away from it. And certainly they had more than enough reason to say the situation is too dangerous, but they didn't do that. And so they're a presence. They're making a difference. On the other hand, some of these non-governmental organizations have been leveraged by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, certainly before October 7th to a great deal, but even after October 7th. And when they allow, Hamas terrorists to visit their facilities, to use their transportation, do something like this, they put themselves at risk. And that's been a problem throughout this entire war. I mean, Hamas and PIJ are essentially terrorist groups, and terrorist groups, by their very nature, try to blend in. That's how they operate. They don't go out in the field of battle and go toe to toe because they don't have the capability to do that. So they try to hide. They try to hide amongst the populace, and that's why it's so difficult to target them sometimes, is because they do that. That's their tradecraft, is to hide amongst the populace and then suddenly pop out, do some sort of action, and then go hide amongst the populace again. And that's what insurgents do. That's what terrorists do. That's what Hamas and PIJ do, which makes targeting them. You'll, as you mentioned, both sides. The family saying, "Oh, of course they're not." And I have to tell you, I have heard that from family, everyone saying, "Oh no, they weren't terrorists." That comes back, and they were absolutely 100% diehard terrorists, and they were completely involved. I'm not saying this individual. I'm not going to prejudge this individual to say that he was, but I would be a little skeptical of whatever the family says because I've just heard it so many times.
Uh, I got to ask about the humanitarian situation. How would you classify it at this point in the war? Over time, has it deteriorated further or has it improved over time?
It's gotten worse and worse over time. If you look at the month by month, it's gotten worse. Now, there has been some increase in aid. That was a lot due to U.S. pressure. It's not nearly where it needs to be, but it is an increase in aid. But there are, there are constant reports there are reports that there is starvation within the Gaza Strip. Certainly, great malnutrition, other health issues that pop up, not just from kinetic stuff, but from disease. Cholera is a constant problem, and a lot of that's due to the fact that the water is in many cases brackish, but it's also there's certainly very little water sterilization going on, and very water treatment, if you will, to make sure people are getting clean, fresh water that is free of various waterborne diseases, and so that creates a problem in and of itself. And then you have the lack of food across the board as well. So things like the World Food Kitchen makes a big difference, as do other groups in there, and they need to do something about the aid. But I juxtapose that with what happened last week. They send in a convoy of a little over 100 plus trucks, and almost not all, but almost all the trucks got ambushed going into the Gaza Strip. And so getting aid, it sounds great to say get aid into the Gaza Strip, get it to those who really need it. But if they go into the Gaza Strip, get a few kilometers, and then criminal gangs come over and hijack the trucks and threaten the drivers and strip all the aid off, and then use it for black market sales to raise money, well, that's a real problem, and that has been a problem consistently. We had that problem when we are bringing them in over the beach, over that J-Lots temporary pier. Same thing. Things were backing up on the beach, because they literally couldn't get it in because of the security situation.
Hal, we got to talk about Syria as well. We have to get a commercial break in right now, if you will. Please stand by. A lot of developments in Syria. We talk about the implications for the U.S. when we return.